Welcome to RajaReads. I'm Masood Raja, and on this channel I introduce you to books from different parts of the world and occasionally also sometimes give you some tips about reading different kinds of books. Today I have a special treat for you. We'll be talking about Zee Edgell's Time and the River. Time and the River by the Belizean author Zee Edgell. Now I must admit that Zee was my former colleague at Kent State University, and she's a wonderful human being, and she is the leading author from Belize, famous for her highly canonized novel Bika Lamb, of which I will have a separate video. But this one, Time and the River, is really a very peculiarly highly researched novel. The story is about Leah Lawson. She is a young slave woman owned by a family, and it is her story, her rise from slavery to marrying her own master and then eventually inheriting his property along with 400 of his slaves, and then dying as a woman who owned slaves, as a woman of African descent. Now, Leah Lawson is a historical character, and Zee Edgell actually did archival research to find her will and her life story. And that's what makes this really a peculiar novel, because it is about an African woman who ended up being a slave owner in her life. That's the one peculiarity of the novel. The other important thing about the novel is that it tells us the story of the Belizean slavery, which was different from the plantation slavery of the Caribbean or the American South, because Belize wasn't a cane plantation economy, it was a timber economy, right? And timber being mahogany. Mahogany was the most prized wood that was extracted from the forests and then exported to Europe. Now, because of that, the slaves, they lived in forest encampments, and they had special trades, like some of them whose job was to spot mature mahogany trees, so they were called spotters, right? And so hence the experience of the slaves is different from the plantation slaves who were held on the plantation and didn't have a lot of freedom of movement. The slaves in Belize, actually within the camps in the forest, had a lot of freedom of movement, but they were of course still enslaved. Now, Leah Lawson is of course a domestic young slave, and her life revolves around this ambition to be free, and the path that she takes is the path of, marrying her master. She has a brother with whom she has a terrible relationship, and then she has two friends who were fellow slaves, Will and Sharper. They are also historical characters, and they are the ones who are at the last moment in the novel. They are fighting, they are freedom fighters. But out of them, Will is the one who was captured as a young boy and brought to the Caribbean, and Sharper had born as a slave. I could have mixed them up, but of course when you read it you'll find it out. But there is a scene which I usually use in my classes to describe about loss of memory. There is a moment where both of them are in a camp, and Will is looking at the fire and he realizes that he has now lost the capacity to recall his mother's face from Africa, right? And that is like an immediate loss of personal memory as a slave. And if you apply it on a larger scale, that's what happens to a lot of deracinated people. Within the first generation, of course, they have no idea where their parents came from, right? And that loss of cultural history and cultural memory traditionally was a huge problem in developing viable African American post-slavery cultures, right? So that's another thing that the novel really clearly brings out within the story. And then the conundrum, this problem of Leah Lawson, who ends up being a slave owner and doesn't really do what romantically we would associate with someone like that she was a slave owner and she was a slave herself. Why doesn't she immediately free her slaves? Right? What stops her from that? That's the question that I asked when I read the novel the first time. And that's the question that a lot of readers also ask. And, Zee Edgell gives us an epilogue. And the epilogue is actually Leah Lawson's will, right, which she leaves. And if you read that, and this is based in an actual historical document, she says, "First I desire that my body may be interned in a Christian-like manner. Secondly, I will bequeath unto so and so and so these things." Then she leaves something to her friend, and that all the remaining acres of her land, she distributes it amongst her slaves. So she waits until her death to free her slaves. So when I taught this novel, that's the question my students ask. That's the question probably that Zee Edgell herself wants to pose here. What is it in a slave-owning culture that when an African woman becomes free and ends up inheriting slave, what stops her from freeing her slaves, right? My personal reading is that it's because within the given economy, if she wanted to maintain the lifestyle that she had, she probably either didn't have the courage or the freedom to do so. And that the only time she can do that is when she dies or when she knows she's dying. So as a gesture of goodwill at the end of her life, she frees all her slaves. So to kind of recap, the novel is set in Belize. It is set at a time when Belize was a British colony. It is set at a time when Belize had the mahogany export economy run through the labor of the slaves. It teaches us about Belizean culture and the beauty of the land, but also of a different kind of slavery that was practiced there. And then within that, it gives us the struggles of Leah Lawson. How does she become the housewife? How does she become the heiress? How does she become the slave owner and plantation owner? But also the two other characters were necessarily not secondary, but important characters, Will and Sharper. Their relationship with Leah, their relationship with the fight against the slave owners and the masters, and then they're the ones who are there at the end of the story. I'll let you read that in your own time. Now, if you're a scholar of postcolonial studies or Caribbean studies, you could obviously read this novel and write about the role of archival research in writing a story. You could also write about were there any other former slaves who ended up being slave owners. You could also do a comparative study of how Belizean history is different from other Caribbean nations, but also how Belizean slavery was different. Obviously, it was slavery, so necessarily we can't say it was better, but what kind of a life did the slaves in Belize live? Another thing that you could also study is the question of masculinity, because there is a time when the Spanish sent in 3 ships to invade Belize. And Spaniards had come in with the promise that they will abolish slavery. But Will and Sharper, because of their idea of self connected to Belize, actually fight against the invaders. And what forces them to do so would be another fascinating study in questions of honor and masculinity, even though the invaders were coming in to capture the territory, but then eventually free the slaves. These are some of the questions that you can ask of the novel and write about. I also highly recommend Bika Lamb, which is a Bildungsromans and for which Zee Edgell is very famous. Now do also keep in mind that Belize is one of the most successful post-colonies, and it also had the single most honor of having elected a person of Palestinian origin as one of their prime ministers. And it has a stronger economy than other Caribbean nations, and part of it is because they have not bought into this tourist industry trade, and they've not bought into cheapening their labor. And that could also be another fascinating study if you're interested in studying, the cultures of the Caribbean, but especially the post-colonies like Belize. So these are some of my thoughts about the novel. I hope at least I've been able to introduce you to it in a way that you would feel like reading it. I highly recommend Time in the River by my friend Zee Edgell, and also her novel Bika Lamb. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for joining this channel. I will now be back with something else. Until then, take care, stay safe, and as always, peace and love.